Okay, so the first game that we're going to show here, with the hanging pawns being defeated, is a game played in 1936 between Max Euwe, former Dutch world champion, and William Winter. So, in the last move, white brought his queen to e2, perhaps eyeing up some e4 ideas, and black continued with c5. Rook a to d1, and now black jumped in with his knight to e4. Here, after d takes c5, he invites black to accept hanging pawns. Now, knight takes c3 occurs first, bishop takes c3, and b takes c5. It's understandable that knight takes c3 would be played, because if b takes c5 immediately, then there's a line such as bishop takes, pawn takes, and now knight e5. And you see that the black queen is misplaced. So therefore, knight takes c3 is an intermezzo. Bishop takes c3, b takes c5, and now c takes d5, and we see that really the move bishop takes d5 would not be a very good idea, since this is now an isolated pawn and it's also an easy pawn to blockade. So instead, black understandably goes for hanging pawns. However, there is a few things about this position that makes it not an especially appealing version of hanging pawns. The main point, for starters, is that there is one set of minor pieces that has already been exchanged. We can see that 3 minor pieces each side. And in this case, as opposed to other positions, well, this is not a minor piece that has been exchanged, let's say, at the expense of white losing one of his bishops and consequently black having the bishop pair, like we saw in this Nimzovich-Tarash game, for those of you who recall the game that ended with a double bishop sacrifice. So after he takes d5, Max plays an interesting move, bishop to a6. And again, it's quite principled to seek to exchange a second pair of pieces, because as we know, we generally are happy to play a simplified middle game or an endgame, because these pawns in the long run are weak. So black rejects this idea and plays bishop to c6. Nevertheless, probably best would have been a move such as queen to b6, and accepting that after bishop takes, queen takes, white is a little bit better, but the pawns can be quite solidly defended. Maybe knight here, rook on c8, rook on d8, and hopefully black can more or less hold in spite of having a weaker structure. At least he still has the center, at least he has a little bit more space. Those things are not great factors given the reduced material on the board, but nevertheless, the structure is not so terrible that white has a forced win or anything like this. I would take the white pieces, but it's not an indefensible disadvantage for black. Okay, so instead, after bishop a6, black tried to conserve the bishop. He went bishop c6. Bishop goes back to b5, and now bishop to b7. But the problem with this is that white is able to exploit this pressure along the d file and also the pressure from the bishop, and plays the move pawn to e4. And so we see that now ideas such as d takes e4 are insufficient, rook takes d7, and if e takes f3, then queen takes bishop. White emerges up a piece. And the tempting possibility of d4, where at least, though the pawns have been forced to advance, they are now easier to blockade, well, at least this situation would be not so bad for black, because this is a protected passed pawn and very dangerous potentially. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for black after simple knight takes d4, c takes d4, and rook takes d4, and we see that there's some serious pressure on this knight on d7. And so, due to tactical reasons, in this position after e4, black, probably his best bet is a move such as knight b6, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and now bishop e5. And the problem is that here, the pawns have been broken up, right? White has succeeded in removing the e-pawn for black's d-pawn, and in the end, there's this weakness. So you see, with hanging pawns, they're very delicate. If you are the side with hanging pawns, you have to watch out that they're not provoked to advance before you want to advance them. You have to watch out that they don't get broken up, because you are left, not only do you lose the benefits of hanging pawns such as space and central control, but you're also left with weaknesses such as this pawn on c5 that is isolated, as well as, of course, worth noting the typical a pawn that is isolated in the hanging pawn structure. So therefore, after e4, black tried to move bishop to f6, but here, in fact, white had a nice tactical idea, e5. The point is that if the bishop moves back, now e6 is problematic. The hanging pawns are left intact, but black turns his attention to weakening an offensive against the king and a weakening of squares like e6, f7, and more generally this diagonal. Nevertheless, Max continued after bishop f6, bishop takes f6, and so he continues in much more strategic fashion. Black cannot take the bishop with the queen because the knight is falling, and so he plays knight takes f6. Now e takes d5, and knight takes d5. And so white is fighting against this weak isolated pawn, as well as later on, potentially this weak a pawn. The game is clearly in white's favor, but it continued a few more moves. The bishop now is fantastically posted here. It's not only playing a blockading role, but it's of course also playing an offensive role. Now, white is actually the one who is enjoying an attack. Normally, it would be the other way around, but black's queen is tied down to the defense of this pawn, and white's pieces now have fantastic squares. Notice that if there was still that hanging pawn, the white bishop would not be anywhere near as active as it is here. Here, there was a tactical shot that ended the game, just showing it to you out of curiosity. The point is, if rook takes, the idea is rook to d7. So there's a double attack. And if, for example, knight takes d7, then queen takes f7 is terrible for black. Everything is just falling. Okay, so this is game one. And I hope you saw some typical ideas like advancing the e-pawn to break up the pawns, and also the removal of some minor pieces. Let's move on to game two. This game took place a little more recently in 1971, Viktor Korchnoy against the Efim Galler, two of the greats of their time. We're on move 8, and Korchnoy with the white pieces just develops normally with bishop to e2. Black goes bishop to b7, and now bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and c takes d5, e takes d5, castle, and queen e7. Now queen to b3 is played, striking at the d5 pawn, and rook to d8. Rook a to d1, all normal moves, and here after c5, finally we see the hanging pawn structure. D takes c5, and if b takes c5, we see the structure. Now, everything would be acceptable here for black because one pair of minor pieces has been exchanged, but note that black at least has the bishop pair, so this is a nice consolation. However, the problem is a very concrete one. The pawn on d5 is hanging. So therefore, it's actually not possible for black to enter a position of hanging pawns immediately. So therefore, he has to interject the move bishop takes c3. The problem is that after queen takes c3, b takes c5, black is keeping the pawn but has lost the bishop pair. And not only has he lost the bishop pair, but we see that there's only two minor pieces for each side. So once again, we're already moving towards a simplified middle game, and the pawns will become more of a liability than an asset. It's very hard to believe that somehow the white king is going to come under severe pressure. Yes, there's some possibility of d4, but that square is quite well guarded. And even if d4, well, we activate this bishop, but as I say, we're missing, for example, this dark squared bishop, as well as an extra knight that might land on e4, right? So we've seen that kind of a setup in the past, a bishop along this diagonal and a knight anchored in the center, supported by that central hanging pawn. So here, Korchnoy just gets to work, rook c1, attacks the pawn on c5, knight d7, responding, rook c2, rook a to b8, and now b3. b3 is a nice idea just in general to avoid this b-file and also eyeing up any possibilities of c4. Though, as we've noted before, d4 is the more common way to advance with the pawns. Black plays the move queen to e6 and now rook to d1. Queen b6 and now knight e1. This move knight e1 may seem like a curious one, but the purpose is to open up the diagonal from e2 to h5 for the bishop. Rook b to c8, black is trying to more or less position himself well. We've seen a similar idea of setting up the rooks behind the pawns and then shifting around with the queen. But of course there were more minor pieces on the board. And black actually in that particular game, for those of you who recall, black had the bishop pair. Anyway, bishop to g4 now occurs, allowing this pin and consequently allowing a possibility, it's in the air, of an exchange of this knight for this pawn. And we're actually in our third and final game, which is a Bobby Fischer with the white pieces game. We're going to see some kind of a similar idea, so keep this in mind. Queen goes to g6 and now bishop to h3. For now, the exchange of the bishop is not necessary. Rook goes to c7 and now knight d3. This is a case where the threat can be stronger than the execution because we have now a really powerful threat of bishop takes d7 and then knight e5 ideas. But for now, while keeping the bishop on h3, it guards against any threats like d4, which would be a double attack. The queen would be hit, and we see that the queen and bishop would be crashing down on g2. So it's important always, when you're trying to carry out a strong strategy, which is a positional strategy fighting against the weakness of the hanging pawns. Nevertheless, you should always be alert to your opponent's counter chances and just counterplay in general. Knight goes to f6, and now queen a5. So we see that the queen, the knight, and the rook are all ganging up on the c5 point, and it is simply overloaded. The knight on d7 as well was one of the key defenders, but the bishop on h3 meant that Geller felt he had to move his knight. Now knight goes to e8, the rook of course was undefended, and rook takes c5. The pawn collapses, and after rook takes c5, queen takes c5. One of the reasons I showed this game is because in fact Geller resigned here immediately. He understood that his position, though only being down a pawn, was just beyond salvation. Why? Because we see that when you accept the hanging pawns, you get 2 pawns on c5 and d5, you get that pawn on a7, and you accept that you're going to have a single isolated pawn, but of course if you lose one of them, you're going to have a second isolated pawn. Or not only if you lose one, but as in the last game, if one pawn gets exchanged, as in the game with Max with the white pieces, we saw this exchange and that pawn on c5 was left chronically weak. So here, this is even worse. Black is down a pawn and has 2 isolated pawns that are both very weak to boot. Another thing perhaps worth commenting is that in hanging pawn structures where the bishop is behind the pawn, you really want to at least have the possibility of an eventual d4, so that this bishop can spring to life at the right moment. In this situation, however, d4 is going to be very unlikely to be made work, and so the bishop on b7 is sort of a poor bishop for the remainder of the game. So therefore, Geller had seen enough and resigned. Okay, the third game that we're going to look at is a game played by Bobby Fischer with the white pieces, as mentioned a few minutes ago. And to my mind, this is really quite a beautiful game. So let's go there and we'll take it from the top. Okay, so here we are. And Bobby Fischer started with the move pawn to c4. This, by the way, was the 6th game of the World Championship match in 1972. So it was really a crucial game. And Fischer decided to go for c4, which was very rare. He was primarily a 1e4 player. I will be showing this game in a little bit less depth than I did in the comprehensive Hanging Pawn series, which is a longer series. So do check that out if you wish. But nevertheless, I'll try and make the main points about this one. So after c4, Spassky went e6, knight f3, d5, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and bishop to e7. So we see a typical queen's pawn opening by transposition. So as we say, queen's pawn openings are what lead to hanging pawn formation. If you want hanging pawns, don't play 1e4. Bishop to g5, and here in this position, castle, e3, h6, bishop h4, b6, and this is the so-called Tartikover variation. Black is trying to solve this problem of the c8 bishop, because of course the pawn is standing in its way here, so there's no possibility of developing to f5. So he naturally seeks the long diagonal here, from a8 to h1. C takes d5, and now in this position, well, e takes d5 is suddenly a little bit less appealing than before, because, well, if you hadn't already committed to this move, you might want to play e takes d5 so that you can then develop the bishop this way. But once you've committed to this move, you might want to play bishop b7 anyway. And in this case, it's just ever so slightly less tempting. So therefore, after c takes d5, knight takes d5 occurs. Notice as well, white has a little bit more space, so it's desirable to exchange a couple of pieces for black. Bishop takes d7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, and e takes d5. So in this position, now, of course, black could have taken back this way, but then it's a little bit passive. So after queen takes e7, now white takes, and is hoping, if black hadn't already committed to this move, then I think that black would be doing okay. But with this slightly weakening move, white plans on putting pressure on this semi-open c-file, and this pawn, even if it moves to c6, well, it will have no support from the b pawn. So this is kind of a very quick explanation of the strategy in play. Rook c1 was white's next move, already taking over the c-file, bishop to e6, and now I really want to note how accurate Fischer's play is with regards to the possibility of hanging pawns arising on the board, right? So here he plays a very nice move, queen to a4. Putting some pressure on the black queen side on the possibility of developing. This knight cannot go to a6, certainly cannot go to c6, and if it goes to d7, then this pawn on c7 will fall. So black plays c5, which is a natural move, contesting the center and also creating the possibility of knight d7 now that rook takes c7 is no longer an option. However, now Fischer plays a very strong move, queen a3. And so we see a major pressure on c5 already on one of the hanging pawns. I call these hanging pawns, even though of course for now there are no two pawns like this, but they're more or less hanging pawns because at any given moment d takes c5 can occur, and then b takes c5 and queen a3. So the same principles are applying. So queen goes to a3, rook to c8, and now another brilliant move by Bobby. Bishop to b5. This is really a great move. Already white is happy about the situation here on c5 because the hanging pawns are about to arise on the board and there are only two minor pieces for each side. And white's pieces are very, very well arranged to fight against one of the hanging pawns. And the other hanging pawn, of course, for now, because white has yet to commit to d takes c5, this pawn is actually inflexible. So white is really able to kind of play with this threat without releasing the tension just yet. The purpose behind bishop to b5 is very simple. If a move such as knight to d7, white will exchange this knight. Now keep in mind that the knight is able to eye up and therefore defend dark squares. This is not the case for the light square bishop. It can never attack such a dark square as c5. So by exchanging this light square bishop for this knight, white essentially is leaving himself with a knight against a bishop, and this knight is a piece that can of course play on both light and dark squares. For instance, it can transfer over and it can put a lot of pressure on c5. And so if black is missing this counterpart, he won't be able to defend the c5 pawn. So this move, bishop to b5, is actually a positionally motivated or strategically motivated move to fight this c5 point. I hope that makes sense. Black now fights back with the move a6, trying to sort of kick out the bishop, but an important point, the rook is undefended. So Fischer simply ignores it and plays d takes c5, as you can see. B takes c5 is played, and here white simply castles. Still, the move knight to d7 is not an option, because the bishop can simply exchange. So black decides to force the bishop to leave b5 by playing the move rook to a7. Now the point is that the queen is defending the rook, and so the bishop must move back. Knight goes to d7 finally, but Fischer continues his assault on these hanging pawns. Once again, notice there is no real dynamic opportunity here for black to use his hanging pawns to sort of create an attack or to cramp white, or even to land the knight on e4 is going to be very challenging because the knight is busy defending the pawn. And Fischer in this position notices that one of the drawbacks of knight d7 is that the rook and the queen are disconnected. And so knight d4. The idea with knight d4, as you can see, is knight b3 to challenge c5. And the point is that if pawn takes knight, the queen is hanging. So therefore, after knight d4, black wants to resolve the issue of his hanging queen, and he plays the move queen to f8. This is not a very good move. The best move would have been knight back to f6. But from a human perspective, this is very difficult to do, because after knight b3, white has managed to transfer his knight from f3 to b3, and black has nothing better than knight d7. So black has just sort of burned time and recognized, hey, you can arrange your knight really well. And now the queen, the knight, and the rook are all crashing down on the c5 pawn, and the queen and the bishop are also crashing down on the a6 pawn. So white's pieces are active and offensively placed, and black's pieces in turn are passive and defensively placed. So this is never ideal. So therefore, after knight d4, black's reaction is very, very understandable, queen f8. But now, a real sign of a brilliant, brilliant chess player, of course Bobby Fischer, one of the very, very best of all time, he plays the move knight takes e6. Now, after knight takes e6, f takes e6, well, it's a complete change of gears, because until now, c5 is the point that white was targeting. It was a dark squared point, and he wanted to conserve the knight. Remember that only a few moves ago, the bishop on b5 was looking to attack that knight on d7. Well, in fact, it was looking to attack the d7 square, such that when the knight landed on d7, he wanted to exchange and really hammer the point on c5. And in the end, it appears that the opposite has occurred. Now, instead of black being the one with the bishop and white being the one with the knight, it's white with the light squared bishop. So therefore, what would make sense in such a situation? It would make sense to focus one's efforts not on c5, the dark squared hanging pawn, but instead on d5. And so white's next move is e4. Notice, by the way, that actually right now we can't speak of them being hanging pawns because the pawn on e6 is here. However, if, for instance, black plays a move such as king h8, now we certainly can speak of them being hanging pawns again. Of course, on such an open board, the bishop is very effective, and there's, of course, all of these pawns are extremely weak. And even the knight and the rook here are a little bit misaligned, so moves such as bishop g4, bishop f3, there are many, many different options, rook f d1. The position is very uncomfortable here for black in the absence of the f pawn. The king is very weak as well. So for all of these reasons, instead, black pushed the pawn on d4. But the problem is that now, what used to be the hanging pawns have been forced to move. They've been forced to move on dark squares, meaning that the blockade will take place on the light squares. And guess what? White has the light squared bishop. So it's a perfect piece for white to create a blockade with. There's another point worth mentioning as well, is that once e4 has been played and d4 has occurred, so now we have a real effective pawn majority here. On the king side, from e to h files, we see that white now has 4 pawns and black only has 3. Now that was always the case, let's say in this position. We still have 4 versus 3, but this pawn on d5 interferes with the mobility of the white pawns. And so it's not really an effective majority. However, after e4, d4, this really is a majority. So it's a majority, and the fact that f takes e6 has occurred means that, well, the hanging pawns are technically no more, but the move f takes e6 not only leaves the e6 pawn weak, but in general compromises the safety of the black king. So Fischer then takes these new kind of particularities of the position and makes the most of them. He plays f4, queen e7, e5, rook b8, bishop c4. So the bishop blockades the pawn, stands on an active square, and f5 is a big threat. Black goes king h8, and now queen h3, targeting that e6 pawn. Black goes knight f8 to defend, b3. Notice how powerless these pawns are to really influence the game. Black goes a5 and f5. The assault continues. E takes f5, rook takes f5. And we see that suddenly all of the white pieces have sprung to life, and somehow all of the black pieces are a little bit awkwardly placed. In addition to this, white is actually the one with a very dangerous mobile pass pawn, whereas the black pawn is going to have real difficulties moving from d4. Notice also that the isolated pawn remains an isolated pawn, so maybe a problem. And unless black finds the time to play a4, which is unlikely because white has some serious threats, such as, for example, rook f7, skewering the rook. So unless somehow black finds the time to get the move in a4, white himself may play the move a4 and fix that isolated pawn. So fix the weakness. Knight h7 was played, and here, by the way, the point is if rook f7, there may be a knight g5 idea. Rook takes e7, knight takes h3, with check, and then the rook will be recovered, so a little tactic. Rook f1, of course, Fischer's not going to fall for that, and instead coordinates all his pieces. Everything is working well together. So queen d8, queen g3, rook e7, h4, killing this knight on h7. No forward jumps. Rook b to b7, and now e6. Rook b to c7, black is really struggling for an active plan, queen e5, centralization of the queen. Queen e8, and now a4. Notice once again that quite pretty picture, all of the black pawns on dark squares, firmly blockaded along the light squares, permanent weaknesses. Black has to be extremely careful that either a5 or c5 will not fall at any given moment, and this ties the black pieces down to their defense. Queen d8, rook to f2. Fischer's just gradually improving his position. He's in no rush. The black problems are there to stay. Queen e8, rook f3, queen d8. I'll show you the rest of the game just for the sake of it. Bishop goes to d3, queen e8, and now queen e4. Black is just powerless other than to shuffle his queen around, and so the battery has been set up, and now threats are in the air, such as rook to f8. Black played the move knight f6, which is probably the only move, but it's insufficient. Rook takes f6, g takes f6, and now rook takes f6. Now black is up in exchange for only a pawn, but the black king's cover has been blown apart. King g8, bishop to c4. Some ideas such as rook to f7 in the air, followed by queen g6. King h8, and now the move queen f4. Striking at h6, threatening rook f8, perhaps rook f7 and some variations. So it's entirely hopeless, and Spassky had had enough and he resigned. Now, a point that I think is worth just keeping in mind is it's very tempting to, let's say, attribute this game as some kind of tactical masterpiece by Bobby Fischer. Some sort of crushing attack, right? An attacking game. But to label it as an attacking game would be doing it an injustice. Of course, it was crowned by a very powerful attack, but understand what led to the attack even being possible in the first place. What laid the foundation of the attack, well, was the superiority of the white pieces, the superiority of this bishop in particular versus the knight, and also the existence of this strong passed pawn that tied black down, as well as some weaknesses over here on the queen side that also tied the black pieces down. So how did all of that occur in the first place? Well, it all occurred right from the get-go, where in such a position as this, Fischer anticipated that black would play c5 and get hanging pawns. And even before the hanging pawns were on the board, Fischer was playing in anticipation of such a possibility, and he was hindering black's development, and black was simply trying to breathe, so to speak. And Fischer did not allow him to do so, and eventually the pressure became too much. And when the pressure became too much, in solving all of his problems, Spassky erred, right? Here, Spassky's best bet was to play knight f6 and stay solid, but he plays queen f8. And after this allows this favorable structural change, and it also allows a favorable minor piece battle. And concretely, there was this move e4, where now if d takes e4, we see what a terrible, terrible pawn structure black has, and also compromised king. And so, seeking to avoid this, Spassky played d4. This is what led to the majority, and then the majority pushed up the board and steamrolled Spassky in combination with the bishop, and generally the better pieces. All of these things are products, at least in part, of the concessions that black had to make due to his fragile pawn structure, specifically his frail hanging pawns that need to be sort of taken care of. So really, I feel like this is a fitting end to this section. I hope that you've enjoyed my analysis of the hanging pawns from both sides. I think it's an extremely important structure. It's a very classical structure in chess. Many high-level games are available, so please check out as many of these games as you wish. And especially, particularly important to do so, if you're a 1c4, 1d4 player, or if you play sort of classical responses against 1d4 or 1c4, you may find yourself needing to go into hanging pawn formation from either side. And so it's important to understand the key elements at play. As said previously, if you want to dive into sort of deeper detail, then please do check out the full series on hanging pawns, the separate series. And yeah, other than that, good luck in your games that feature hanging pawns. I hope you enjoyed this series. I hope you enjoyed the examples presented, and I will see you in the next section.